Welcome to Behind the Brief, the podcast where we go beyond the buzzwords, dive deep into the marketing strategies that actually work. I'm your host, Shruti Verma, and today's guest is someone who gets the reality of product launches, not just the hype. She is a 4-time startup PMM leader, GTM strategist, and the voice behind PMM Power Hour. Allison, welcome to my show.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Same here. So, Allison, you have a decade in product marketing experience. You have led your fair share of product launches, some very polished, some chaotic. I know they can be really messy. For a product marketer who's handed a feature 2 weeks before GA and being told to launch it, what advice would you give to them, and how do you elevate that into something more impactful, or do you draw a boundary there?
You know, I think in product marketing, we like to think that that's not going to happen, right? That you're just handed a feature and said to launch it, right? I think you've got like the ideal scenario, and where you are working closely with the product team, you are listening to customers, or you're just you've got the beat on the market, and you're helping to direct the roadmap, and so you're working really early, right, with the product team. And you're not just handed a feature, to launch, but you're actually like shaping what that feature is going to be. You're shaping not just the go-to-market strategy, but really what the actual feature is going to be built, right? The functionality of it and how it's going to help, the customers. But we know that doesn't always happen. And sometimes, features are just kind of launched or released, right? And then it's handed to you. And I will say, there is a difference, right, between a release and a launch, right? Like, I think that product teams often are fearful when they hear that product marketers like own launches. And I'll say own, right, in air quotes, but I feel like sometimes they're afraid and saying, well, if you're owning a launch, does that mean that I can't actually release, or I can't actually, push any new updates? And no, that's not true, right? So like product marketers, or at least from my perspective, like at least working in the startup space, like you should never stop releases, from actually happening. But we're actually, like I said, there's a difference between a release and a launch. And a launch is what you're doing, right, to kind of get the word out and making sure that there's an impact. So back to your original question, right, about what happens when you're just handed you're just said, hey, we're releasing something, and product marketers had no idea it was coming, and you're just going to like, what do you do with all this? And I think that, at first you should start off with some kind of documentation from the product team. I've found that this has been helpful. And I think there are lots of templates and things out there, right? Some people call it like a handoff brief or an FAQ brief or whatever it is you want to call it. But the whole idea behind it, right, is to understand, basically what the feature is, right? Who it's being built for, right? Because if you're having multiple personas, right, or, multiple use cases, you want to understand who it's being built for, what the use cases are, what the metrics are, like how are you measuring usage, right? How are you going to know that if somebody's actually using it? Are we, set up to capture all of that? So you kind of get the basics, right? And then I know that there's more, basics than just that, but that's kind of like the main, just kind of like the baseline there, right? And then, I start to kind of craft the messaging around it, right? So now that I know who it's for, kind of the value that it provides, the use cases, I want to see it in action, right? So getting whatever screenshots or demos or whatever from the product team so I can see, what it's going to look like once it's done. And then I start crafting everything and start getting it ready for the launch. And sometimes the launch can be, if it's something minor, right? Like we know that you've got to tier launches up, right? Not if something is just handed to you, right? It's not going to be like a big tier 1 launch, right? It's got to be something. Yeah, it's got to be something small. Like nobody, hopefully, right? You're not just your product team, but you're the CMO and the CEO, and everybody's not expecting some big, huge, tier 1 launch if you're just handed some information, right? 2 weeks before it's going to be released. So at the very least, you've got to enable, your teams on it, right? Making sure that that your sales team, your CS team, you understand exactly who it's for, the message around it, how to demo it, what the FAQs are, around it, what limitations it has, getting all of those details, ready off the bat, that's kind of what you got to do. That's kind of like the baseline, obviously, and then whatever marketing messaging, right? And how do you find your customers, right? Who is it for? Are you doing, what kind of campaigns are you doing? Obviously there's, email campaigns, but whatever other campaigns, right, in that you can kind of manage in 2 weeks to kind of, get off the bat, just to get up and running. Highly recommend, right? Like, you map that out. But, to kind of not to prevent this from happening in the future, but to level set expectations, I think having kind of a general launch plan available for the different tiers. So, like, when there's a big tier one launch, people understand what the marketing moment is. They understand that they're going to get a big splash in the market. But for these smaller ones, they've got to understand that they're not getting the royal treatment, right? Not they, but the feature isn't getting the royal treatment because, it's something that's smaller. We can also talk about tiering and levels and all that stuff as well. But
Absolutely.
those are my thoughts, right? So
Yeah,
sorry, I know that was like kind of a long answer to your question, but I know that it takes a lot, right? Sometimes it can be, at least for early career PMMs, it's like, what do I do with all this,
exactly.
right? So
Yeah, I think even high level PMMs who have like a decade of experience and more than that do feel overwhelmed when they are launching a product.
totally.
And when a new PMM, early stage career PMMs, and also, mostly the audience of this podcast is, they are in that stage where are they really gonna own a launch? So I think that's the disconnect here, and I really want to dig deeper into this topic. So you have, earlier mentioned that there's a huge difference between releases and launches. I would love to know how much of a launch does a PMM actually own, and how has that changed? Like, has it changed for a startup versus an enterprise environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do say that product marketers actually own the launches. And but that's not to say that they do everything for a launch. It means that, you often hear about like the term quarterbacking, right? Like kind of that launch. That means that they're setting up kind of they're the ones who are it's a very it's a cross-functional, not performance. It's a team sport, right? Let's just put it that way. Launching is a team sport, right? It involves so many different stakeholders, right? But the product marketer is the one who kind of sets up everything. So that's why you hear that product marketers own a launch. But a product marketer is not expected, let's say, if there's an ad campaign, product marketers aren't expected to, go in, and set up the ad campaign, right? But a product marketer is expected to create the messaging that's used within the ad campaign, right? So by ownership, I think that's what people mean, right? Like for anyone here who's just asked about your launch ownership, it's you are, working together very closely with the product to set up, well, what is the tier here, right? How big of a splash, like what we were just talking about, right? How big of a splash is this launch going to be? And then you're kind of delegating almost, right? You're setting up, we talk about that RACI chart, right? Who does what, right? Who is responsible in very small, lean teams. Like for me, I've been on enterprise teams, right? Where I've been one of, early in my career, I was one of like 20 product marketers. And I've also been a solo product marketer. And there's a big difference between what you're doing when you have an enterprise team, right? And you have lots of different people in the organization versus being a solo PMM. From a solo PMM or a team, just a small team in general, you are setting up and you do have to do a lot of that stuff, right? But like, let's say there is, you're writing, a blog content or you're creating video content, right? Or maybe you're hosting a webinar or whatever that is, right? You're working with your marketing team. You're working with, your other folks, like maybe you're the one who's writing the email. If it's a bigger team, maybe somebody else is writing the email or even the blog post or, setting up the webinar, but you are the one who's making sure that it all happens. You're setting up what is actually happening, right? What channels, what's happening in the message that's being played out. So I do think that product marketers should own it and should be able to talk about what they do for a particular launch. And if you haven't done that, right, it could, I'm not saying you have to have had the biggest launch, right? Like you're putting something at Dreamforce, right? Or, you know, one of these big events, right, where you're doing all that. That's not the reality for a lot of startups, right? You're not having those big ginormous marketing moments. But you are still setting the tone, you're setting the message, and you're setting up how you're going to get the message out, what channels to use.
Exactly. And I think it has always been like, oh, it's a product launch. You have to prepare 2 quarters in advance and you have to get all the teams ready. That is true. Very much true. But even for a smaller launch, like you do not have to launch it on all the channels that you usually, market it to. I think,
Totally.
yeah, that's
Yeah, no,
something
I
that we
think
really
that's
need
right.
to talk
Yeah,
about.
yeah, for sure. It
Yeah.
doesn't need to be, I mean, well, we talk about there's the launch, but how do you keep momentum, right, after your big thing, right? Like, is a launch just a social post on LinkedIn? Right? Like you think about, right? I don't know, there's some number that is out there, some stat that it's like how many times does someone have to hear something or see something before they remember, right? Like
Yeah.
while we are launching something, we know the messaging and it's been in our heads maybe for months, maybe for weeks, right? And we know it and are preparing and everything. You know, our customers, just because you put it in an email, just because you put it in a, LinkedIn post or, and do a few other things doesn't mean that they're going to remember anything.
Exactly.
Right? So how do you keep that momentum, right? It's like thinking about it for maybe a quarter's worth of content, maybe less, maybe more, right? Kind of depending upon the org, right? But how do you keep coming back to like the problem that it solves and keep bringing things up so that your company is top of mind, right? And that people associate your company with that problem that's to solve and maybe they don't even know what your product does, but maybe they know that you talk about a certain problem and that you compete in a certain industry. And so yeah, so I think about, right, like there's the launch, there's the one channel. Yeah, you just got to keep the momentum, which is easier said than done, right? Especially if you have a lean team, you're like,
Oh my God.
yeah,
Then
you've
it's
launched it and then you got to pretty much move on to the next thing, right? Like there's
right.
only so much you can do. But I think that ideally you're setting yourself up for failure if you're just kind of announcing something once and you don't kind of move, keep talking about it for several months.
Absolutely. And I think even if we switch gears to seeing it from a consumer side or from a customer's lens, I would like to see things happening all the time so that it becomes my muscle memory. I do remember some brands because they are so consistent with their messaging, so consistent with the value they bring for some of the tools that I use. We really have to think it from a customer's point of view when we have to build that consistent strategy around how we talk about the launch as well, post the
Totally.
launch.
Totally. I mean,
Yeah,
even looking at, yeah, consumer brands, right? How many emails do you get about the same products, right? The same jeans that are on sale or whatever, right? And, about that. So it's over and over and over again, right? How many
absolutely.
Instagram ads are you getting about the same thing? Because you have to see it multiple times. And the more you see it, it just goes into your mind and
Yeah,
you remember it and you're constantly, and
absolutely.
then you're thinking about it, all the time. So it's the same thing in B2B. We're all just people. We all got busy lives. It's a good thing to just keep momentum going and keep reminding people why you exist and more importantly what problems you solve and how they can use it. It's not just about me, right? When it comes to the product, but it's about the customer itself, right? It's about you customer, right? And how are we, what issues are we seeing out there with them and how we can help.
Oh my God, yeah. And I think it's high time in B2B things change a little bit. We should not be following some old playbooks. Things need to shake up a little to actually make that impact and think of software buyers as normal human beings. I think that kind of shift really has to come somewhere in B2B as well.
Totally. I think you've got to write for like one person, right? We put this, we start thinking about, oh, how am I going to market to enterprise orgs in, like X segment in Y industry, right? At this job title, forget all that. what does if I'm like, what does Shruti care about, right? I'm writing specifically my messaging for Shruti, right? Or for whoever, right? I got to put a name, I got to put a face, right? I've got to do all those things, and then my messaging, the channels, like everything that I'm doing is to target that right person, because right, like then you're really honing in on something, right? Instead of being just bland and generic and vague. And to your point, things are just changing so rapidly that the way to stand out is to be specific and to be right and to really just talk to that one person. Like, I think that we've gotten, it's funny. I think it's just all like back to basics, though, to be honest. Like, everyone wants to use a new tool or figure out. And I think, like, yes, we need to really like keep at the forefront of, what's happening, keep our finger on the pulse, right, of the market. But I think that knowing your customer, right, like I said, get back to basics, know your customer, know what they care about, know where they hang out, right? Know what's going to resonate with them, use their own language, right? It's not rocket science. Like it's like simple, it's easy, right? Like it sounds easy, but it's not easy to do, because yeah, you get pulled in 50 million directions and all the things. But yeah, talking to that one person and just getting back to basics and really like, know your customer, know what they care about. So that's going to really help with any launch that you do, frankly, right?
Yeah, I think that 1% also makes a lot of difference and like on the overall launch strategy as well.
Yeah, for sure.
I really want to focus on this launch segment as well. So, how should early career PMMs think about building that launch muscle? Because you just talked about having all the, steps to actually think of a launch, plan the launch strategy. But I know having that full ownership of a launch is something that's really scary, even for a person who is already so much experience in this field in PMM. So, are there ways to stretch that muscle? Because we don't have a PMM school. Nobody taught us how to do PMM, how to launch stuff. Maybe now there are many playbooks that we can follow, some frameworks. So, having that title of a launch owner, what are the things that you can suggest to people who really want to build that launch muscle and become a really good product marketer?
I think, well, like I'd mentioned, it goes back to knowing your customer, right? If you don't know your customer, you don't know what problems you're solving for, right? And you don't know how to reach them, your launch is going to fall flat, right? It's going to fail, like, no matter what, right? So start with that. That's like the easy stuff. And it doesn't matter, like, anyone, right, can do that. Anyone can do that. Anyone can listen to gong calls. Anyone can be a fly on the wall on live calls. Anyone can, like read the reviews, right? Knowing that, just to really understand, that getting that customer voice. But when it comes to actually owning the launch and how to actually do it from scratch, if you've never done it before, hopefully you're not, if you're joining an org as an early career PMM, they're not necessarily throwing you in the deep end. But if you are, right, like, and just saying, okay, get this done. Hopefully you've got, a manager who's there to help guide you and to give you kind of resources on, this is what we're doing for a tier 2 launch, let's say, right? Here are kind of the steps that we generally take. And if you don't have that, I would say there's a whole community of product marketers that you can rely on, right? And so there's a ton. You can find people who you admire on LinkedIn, right? You can follow people. You can ping, there are tons of different product marketing communities, from the Product Marketing Alliance to PMM Camp, right? There are other mentorships and everything. So I would say ask people, right? How to do it, right? You don't have to do all this stuff alone. I think a lot of people are afraid of asking for help. They're afraid of maybe looking stupid or foolish, or they don't know exactly what it is, but nobody is expected, to know absolutely everything. You learn by doing. That's really what it is. I mean, that's what, when I first started out, right, I was given frameworks, right? Like, hey, here are frameworks that you're going to use, and this is how we're going to do the launches, whether it's a messaging framework or a campaign, template or something like that. This is what we do. And so, and I learned, and when you do it that way, you can see what works and what you would change for the next time, right? And so, And that's kind of what I did, right? Is that I kind of got the basics down, right, from those initial frameworks that like my managers would give me. And then I started iterating. And as I started owning things myself, and I know you hesitate to use the word own, but as I started to just like manage, let's just say that
Yeah.
manage launches myself, then I started to take those processes and those templates and tweak them for my own purposes, right? And even still, even though I've done it for quite a while, I love looking at what other people do. I get it. I get so much inspiration from it. So for instance, I have my own templates and frameworks and stuff that I've used. I know, kind of when to use it, when to not use it, or when to iterate on it. But for instance, I've also looked at the PMM Jetpack, right? And I've seen what templates are used over there. And so sometimes I just see a couple of things in like their launch docs and I'm like, hey, that's pretty cool, or like I didn't include that in mind, or it's something where it just added a little extra something, to my own template, some more information that made my launches stronger just by keeping on the pulse. So I think that, there's so many templates, so many frameworks. You can, pick one. If your manager, if your CMO or whatever is not giving it to you, pick one, use it, right, for your first launch, and then iterate from it. You'll see what works and what doesn't, right? Like for instance, if your launch says that you need to do a press release on it, right, as a specific tactic, but your particular launch, like, or maybe your team can't do that or doesn't have that muscle, then okay, remove that and do something different, right? Like, use what works for your particular customers.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
if you don't know what your customers, where they hang out, what they listen to, what's going to resonate with them, then it doesn't really matter what tactics you use. Everything's going to fall flat.
Absolutely.
And if you're just having, there's a smaller release and right, and customers need to, are just upgrading a feature or something like that, right? And that's not necessarily tied to its own revenue number, right? So no matter what, there are ways of learning it. And of course, not every single launch goes 100% smoothly, and of course there are wins and there's failures, and successes along the way. You should always be learning, right? And how to tweak things and iterate things for the next time so you can get a somewhat repeatable process if possible. That said, like I said, you need to treat different launches differently and know that at least if it falls flat, it's a learning experience and how you can change for the next time. But I will say, while not every launch is like a huge, multi-million dollar revenue driver, I think that, yes, of course, some launches are more important or more impactful, right? Than for sure.
So I have one last question on product and launches, specifically in the hiring era of product marketing. Reality is many PMMs inherit features very late or operate in environments where launches are across teams. Maybe you are not owning a launch, you are just executing it, or you are just part of a team that's just assisting the launches. So how do you think this disconnect is actually shaping how PMMs represent themselves, and what's the risk of it? I have seen so many people who have come to me and said, I have never owned a launch, but in interviews I'm expected to state a number of launches I've owned as a product marketer. So I don't know where the disconnect is, but I would love to know what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah. Well, I would think that hiring managers are likely not caught up in like the number of launches. Like in my experience when I was interviewing, right? I didn't have anybody ask me about like how many launches have you done. Instead, I think they focused on kind of tell me about one specific launch, right? And your role in it. Even while you may not, right, for those who are like at bigger orgs who have only done, right, a small sliver, right, of a launch, you can still talk about how you've affected and impacted that campaign. So talk through the campaign, why the launch, was happening to begin with, right? Like why was your organization launching that new feature or new product or whatever, right? Was it based upon, customer complaints, right? Was there another functionality? Were you trying to, increase your TAM? Like whatever, what's the reason why your company was launching that? And then you can talk through about all the different parts of the launch, but really focus upon the part that you played and the impact that you had on the launch. So it's okay if you haven't owned or if you haven't done every single thing, right? From end to end or soup
Right.
to nuts, as they say, right? Really just say, okay, well, my part of the launch, okay, here's the launch, here's why it happened, here's what we were doing, here's the situation,
Right.
right? And my part was I did A, B, and C, and this is the impact it had on the launch. So for anyone out there who is interviewing right now, right, I would say just focus on you, right? Put yourself, like insert yourself into the launch system, right? Or the launch process and
Right.
show your unique and specific impact. And if you don't have, raw, that hard numbers like you led to, whatever increase in revenue, I think there are ways of kind of estimating that and looking at, well, what are the goals of the launch to begin with, right? Like, is it revenue related, right? Maybe you have an estimate there, or was the goal, right, to kind of have, like, maybe you just focused on sales enablement tools, right? Maybe you created things, you helped your sales enablement, whether you have a team or you just worked on the training aspect of it, right, with your sales team. So you can talk about their confidence numbers. You can talk about how, like, the sales velocity numbers, right? You can talk about those types of things and your impact there. So really look through and figure out where, like insert yourself into the process, right? Where you yourself made the impact, even if you were not kind of running the whole show.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point because maybe the hiring managers, I think I'm 100% certain the hiring managers are looking for where your contribution has been. But you've mentioned it very, very clearly that it's something that you can just still own up as a story.
Totally. I mean, launches are by nature cross-functional. So they involve so many different teams and you can talk through, right? You can tell them what the different teams were responsible for. But if you're in an interview, you want to mention your specific impact. So be brief, right? When you're talking about other teams, right? But really focus on the things that you did and the impact that you provided when it comes to even just that small part. If you only played a small part, really focus on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I want to shift gears a little bit. And I know everybody is talking about AI, so definitely I have to bring that segment as well. Earlier when we were talking, you mentioned that you use AI as your thought partner. So I really want to focus our energy into that and want to know how are you using AI tools in your maybe day-to-day workflow or certain things that help you be a better product marketer or in general be more efficient. What's a concrete way it has helped you to stay sharp in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, look, there's always a new AI tool, right? That's kind of come out and I experiment with them, from time to time. But I have to say I still go back to ChatGPT, pretty frequently. That's kind of like my base. So, and when I say thought partner, I think through, like, even if you're, let's say, like, if I'm doing a launch, right? I could throw some ideas, into ChatGPT and ask them to kind of poke holes in it, or if I'm saying, hey, I'm going to run this kickoff, right? So I've used this before. I'm going to, talk through a launch with my team or the item. Here's what I'm going to say, right? Help me level up my communication, right? Internally, poke holes in it. What do the executives want to see? Am I including too much detail? Am I not including enough detail? Right. And so that's what I kind of mean by thought partner, right? It's kind of just being like my product marketing BFF, right? Where there's somebody on the inside and it's somebody just giving me, their opinion on how to maybe craft my or really what tone am I using? How do I craft things a little differently? I do have to say, sometimes, obviously Chat GPT will give you some very direct feedback that, I then push back on. So, for instance, if, they're saying they poke holes, right? Let's say in what I'm creating, if I have a document, right? And I'm saying, hey, here's what I want to share. What holes do you have? what should I be thinking about? How should I present this better? And then ChatGPT gives me their feedback. And then I can respond back and say, but what about A, B, and C, right? And start giving my side of the story, so to speak. If I didn't, have the perfect prompt, right? And still, like, I think everybody's working on just like what to say, right? But still just looking at that and saying, kind of going back to it and being a little challenging to ChatGPT, right? And so you can do that very easily and just start poking holes. If they're poking holes in your stuff, right, in your content, I poke holes right back. And so then we have
Yeah.
like a little dialogue, right, in ChatGPT. So I've used it that way. Like I said, I've used various tools, right? Like beyond, I've used Perplexity. I know Perplexity gets people think about that for research, that it's better for research. And I do like it. Like, so when doing kind of competitive research, on a specific company, I would dive into Perplexity. I should probably compare, right? Like do the same prompt and compare it, Perplexity, ChatGPT, and Claude, and see what happens, what happens with it. I think everyone's got their own favorites also for tone of voice and, and how the AI interacts with you. And so ChatGPT it's just been the one that I've gone back to. But another tool I used recently was a tool for like image generation, and I think that the image generators you get at ChatGPT or even Canva or whatever, those are great for kind of these, hey, if you know exactly what you want and it's very straightforward, right? Like I want, I want a tiger, right? Like sit in a field, right, with a couple of trees, right? Like those imagery, like using that for imagery is a no-brainer. But if you're trying to create an image from a process, let's say, for me, that's super challenging. How do I visualize a process, right? Like that a product would do, or a person would go through. I used something called napkin.ai, and that helped me kind of visualize a process, right? I've used tools to like create presentations from a document with, mixed results. I don't think it's not all quite there yet. But I've also used AI for like win-loss analysis, and things where looking at like using Gong's own AI, but also kind of taking that information and moving it to ChatGPT to kind of find trends within it, right? I feel like that was super helpful to do that. So, I know we get focused a lot on the tools. This is kind of like the same thing with launches, right? You get focused on the tools or the product, right? But really, what problems am I trying to solve and how is AI going to help me? I think there's so much more. I know there's so much more I could be doing. There are workflows I could be creating. I need to explore creating my digital twin, right? As they say, to kind of offload certain tasks, right? Like, so I'm doing some of that. I'm exploring with making my own GPTs. And this is for my own, in my personal world, right? My personal life. Haven't done it yet for the work life. I feel like, one step at a time, right? So I'm making these custom GPTs for myself, and then I'll move it on, right? And do it for the orgs that I'm working with.
So true. And I think earlier it was just AI tools that you can try. It was just hit and trial for that. I think with the ongoing conversations around AI agents and how they're actually getting ingrained into your daily workflow is something pretty crazy that I am seeing. It's like a trend that's happening, but I am sure it's no longer gonna be a trend. It's something that will be very normal in maybe a year or two, and you will be offloading so many things that you used to take hours to actually do it. So it's kind of pretty crazy to see how deeply it's impacting our day-to-day work life, whatever we used to do, maybe check our emails. And I think they're gonna be AI agents for everything that we are currently doing right now. So I don't know.
Totally. I think, yeah, I mean, you hear agentic AI, right? Exactly. These AI agents. And I think and even people who are creating full teams, right, of different AI agents, right, in order to offload tasks or multiply, right? You always say, do more with less, right? And this is how you do it, by having that extra set of hands, right? Personally, if somebody is, also they talk about doing an AI agent that will like send emails on your behalf, right?
Yeah.
I'm still nervous, frankly, about doing that. I think it's a great idea for an AI agent to to be created, and like they can craft the email, let's say. And I know this is big in the sales world, right? So
Right.
because I've worked in sales tech for a long time, and sellers are totally overwhelmed, right? And just being able to send in mass. But when an AI, if you're trusting AI to speak on my behalf and it's my name that's attached to that, that makes me nervous without my oversight. So AI agents create all the things that you want, whatever content or emails or whatever it is. But for right now, I'm still thinking that humans need to be involved in order to check that, because we all know that AI is still like hallucinating and making up all this stuff. And that is a problem if I'm sending an email out and it's inaccurate and I've just let the AI agent do its thing. But even
Yeah.
on the B2B side, right, you've got the AI agents who are able to hopefully solve problems and everything, right, for like the
Absolutely.
customer success. But yeah, I think there are always still people who want to talk to a human. Like for me, I always still want to talk to a human because they can understand context, right? And they can kind of get things resolved, usually faster, honestly.
Yeah. Right.
So, but I know everything will be getting better over time.
For sure. Absolutely. I think we definitely we need to have that. We have talked a lot about AI, the use cases, but I think that's the end of our session today. And I hope you enjoyed as much as I did talking about all things product launches. And then we just got into the rabbit hole of AI and prompt engineering.
Of course, of course. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for having me today, Shruti. I'm super glad that you decided to reach out and that we could have this conversation. Love chatting about processes and making things happen. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Allison. And that's a wrap on today's show. And one more thing, where can people reach out to you if they really have questions following up on what we discussed today? So just let
Yeah.
us know.
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always on LinkedIn. So that's the best way to reach me, connect with me, DM me if you have any questions. And yeah, that's great.
That's amazing. And I'll be putting your LinkedIn link under the description of this video so people can reach out to you. Thank you so much, Allison.